Hello, I'm James Warren.
And I'm Andy Cushion.
And you're listening to the Denver Urbanism Podcast, a podcast on all things bridge building in the crisscrossed city of Denver.
James, can I just tell you about the stupidest thing I've ever heard?
I would love that.
The stupidest thing I've ever heard is the notion that the only thing missing, the crown jewel that would make the campus in front of the Colorado State Capitol better, is a bridge.
Yeah, that's a pretty silly concept, but I mean, is anyone seriously talking about that? Who of the trusted individuals in our society would be talking about this?
Yeah, so the governor himself and and a bunch of other people, around him who are all going, yes, what a great idea. Nice idea. Ooh, very nice idea. They want to have a big project, understandably so, to celebrate the state's 150th anniversary of existing in its current political form.
I want that too.
Yeah, I mean, why not? A big project sounds like a lot of fun. Great excuse to cut ribbons. Politicians love cutting ribbons.
Yeah.
But this idea of a bridge that would be theoretically just sort of connecting the front of the Capitol, but not specified where, to the state park, which is between Lincoln and Broadway, and at some later date connecting to Civic Center Park. This bridge was laughed out of the room the second that advocates heard about this.
Right.
I know all of you listening read a little article about this, read something on Reddit, heard it on, Colorado Matters or whatever it was, and thought, where are they even describing? Like, where would that bridge go? What would be the purpose of that?
Right.
And
well, now, here's the thing, and our dear listeners may feel the same way, is that it's pedestrian infrastructure. When the state or the city or some entity comes in and says, we want to give you upgraded pedestrian infrastructure, you say yes. But there's something about this that is just so backwards. Can you put that into words for me?
Yeah, I mean, the fact that it is dumb and the fact that it is obviously dumb does not actually excuse then advocates from trying to articulate better how dollars spent on improving the pedestrian realm are actually better spent not building a bridge. So let's start with the first element of mischaracterization. So if you read some of the press releases or the sort of media coverage, which really kind of aped a lot of the language from the press release, you would hear Broadway and Lincoln characterized as urban highways, right?
Right.
And now Broadway and Lincoln are a lot of things. They're busy streets. They're part of the high injury network. 100%. They could use some love. There are existing crossings at 14th, 13th, Colfax, 16th, 17th. There's already surface crossings there because it's not actually a highway. It's just a one-way street that moves a lot of vehicles.
Yeah, and in a world of already fairly defined terms, arterials, collectors, highways, these things are pretty easy to look up.
Yeah. When you get stopped by a traffic light, it's not a highway.
Right.
It's as simple as that on some level.
I guess some of our, federal, Colorado, these are technically state highways.
The point being, though, that there is not currently a crisis of people finding themselves at the corner of Broadway and 14th and going, what? How do I get this 90 feet across the street here? It's certainly a busy street. There are crashes that happen, and it's part of the high injury network. But we don't lack for crossings and pedestrian infrastructure that already exists. What we lack is safer, more calm and tranquil and uplifting settings to be a pedestrian, right? If Broadway got a road diet, which it could because it's not an actual interstate highway, it's just a regular street. 14th recently got a road diet. I mean, there have already been improvements here that have made it easier to cross these streets and transit signal priority and all sorts of reasons that people are walking on the sidewalk along these streets. So the idea of a bridge here, so totally thrown out, kind of coming from nowhere. And no advocates were talking about this prior to the governor's press release about this. Just kind of shows you how shallow the thinking is in terms of pedestrian improvements.
I almost hear you saying that this is a solution in search of a question. And that really, if they had just tried to listen for the question, they would have gotten separate solutions. There are ways to improve Lincoln and Broadway. There are things that you could do tomorrow that would really make it better for pedestrians. And among that list would not be a pedestrian bridge. Am I hearing you right on that?
You are. There are ways that the pedestrian realm around the state capitol could be better. My big idea is bury all of the parking that currently is just so stupidly surrounding a beautiful, iconic building in this state. Put it all underground and turn that over into like a nice plaza instead. That's my take. But it undermines then the fact that bridges are useful. And we even had a series of second wave pieces locally in the media about like, well, what pedestrian bridges do we have? Where do they work and where have they been torn down in the city? And it really just sort of like undermined the notion that like pedestrian bridges are actually a great piece of design that can make people's lives better in a lot of circumstances that are not stupid and brainless.
Yeah, and that's, I think, where I want to take the conversation today. Is just like, let's focus on what are the right circumstances for pedestrian bridges. It's not crossing over Lincoln and Broadway, but there are, of course, circumstances in which pedestrian bridges are necessary and in which they actually massively improve the pedestrian realm. So maybe talk me through a little bit about what we're trying to do with pedestrian bridges and what is the right context for installing one.
So pedestrian bridges, back in the day when all we had were feet, all bridges were pedestrian bridges, which with occasional oxen and, horses crossing them too. Bridges then are useful for crossing barriers. There are streams, there are gullies, there are gulches, there are rivers, there are places that flood and are unsuitable to cross that at other times of the year are totally normal to cross. The city has had bridges for many years in all sorts of great places. But now that we live in a world not just full of natural environments and sort of natural barriers, but also full of man-made barriers, pedestrian-specific bridges are good for those man-made barriers as well. So think about, sure, as I just said, streams and gorges and rivers and creeks and stuff, but also actual highways where there will not be a light for you to cross them. Actual railroad tracks where it is unsafe and inconvenient for the person who's in charge of scraping your guts off the front of the train, for you to be crossing the tracks, willy-nilly at any time of day or night. Pedestrian bridges are also helpful in very narrow kind of geographic circumstances where it actually just makes it faster. We don't even think of them sometimes as bridges. Sometimes we're talking about like public staircases that get you sort of up a pretty significant elevation change without sort of having to kind of walk around a long way. But bridges can also, in those moments, provide almost an aesthetic experience too, or offer a kind of complement to the natural feature of the area that gives you an opportunity for reflection and for placemaking. Bridges are also useful, again, in a world where we have man-made and natural barriers that separate communities. You then oftentimes get very distinct disparities. Think about a neighborhood on one side of a highway, close to Wash Park, and a neighborhood on the other side of the highway, close to DU. These neighborhoods are like right next to each other. But unless you have regular links that make it easy for people to go back and forth from one neighborhood to the next, if you're a student in Wash Park and you want to then go to the university in, DU or something like that, it becomes much more complicated for you to get to school. It really inhibits, your ability to shop, work, learn, travel. So pedestrian bridges are then also useful too because they actually just like make things happen. You would not have done those journeys that were blocked or inconvenient because of the barriers that were in your way before until there was a pedestrian bridge. And now those journeys become more feasible, more convenient, more enjoyable. Pedestrian bridges are actually very useful.
Yeah, and I think when you're talking about sort of that access component, whether it be academic access, economic access to just the basic needs and necessities in life. One of the things that it's conjuring for me is that, to go a mile out of your way in a car, it may be a bit of a drag, but ultimately just fine. You move your foot a little bit more and spend slightly more at the gas station. Going out of your way a mile on your feet is, for many people, a non-starter. And so a pedestrian bridge really does provide access to areas in a way that is a little bit more immediately needed and requires just simply more pedestrian bridges to accomplish the same kind of economic and other types of access that cars don't even need to bother with because they can drive farther distances.
Correct. We're talking here about certain latent demand that then becomes induced by this new infrastructure. So right now you're a tourist and you want to go up and see the Colorado State Capitol. You have ways to cross the street to get there. There is not a shortage of tourists at the foot of the Colorado State Capitol taking photos of the mountains and, the city and county building, or vice versa, coming up and taking photos of the, state capitol. But there was, until the bridge was built from the lower highlands to sort of the Platte Street area, there was a difficulty and an inhibited demand for going back and forth between those neighborhoods until the consolidated main line came to be by consolidating certain tracks. It was basically impossible to sort of walk at grade in certain areas of lower downtown or close to the South Platte River. Those areas became reclaimed. We got a consolidated main line. And then in order to keep the economic stimulus and placemaking going, we built then a bunch of pedestrian bridges that cross the CML in lower downtown.
And just for some context for the things you're just talking about, we used to have a bunch of railroad tracks that came through town, and we made them fewer railroad tracks, and all the trains used those fewer railroad tracks, which allowed us to create more crossings.
Another part, exactly as you say, James, a pedestrian only has so much time to make a journey, sort of an absolute hours or minutes of their day, until it becomes like really kind of silly for them to be trying to accomplish that on foot. And in a city that we currently inhabit, where we want more people to make journeys on foot, pedestrian bridges go a long way towards actually getting people to visit their friend's house on foot, to go to the grocery store on foot, to go to work on foot, or to cross that busy highway in order then to take the bus or take the light rail to then go the rest of the way. So in a network that we're trying to build, which prioritizes non-single occupancy vehicle modes, we then have to do more work in order to make those options more attractive when you're not in the car.
I think I also, because we've largely talked about bridges to this point in terms of conveyance, which is sort of, folks have listened to our recent podcast with Ken. If you haven't yet, go listen to it before you hear the next thing I'm going to say. I'll wait. Welcome back. One thing that Ken pointed out is that roads can function in a variety of ways, one of which is conveyance, one of which is taking you from point A to point B, taking you from your house to the butcher, to the baker, to the candlestick maker. And another one is public realm. And I think this kind of captures it very nicely. Many of us are probably familiar with the idea of taking a loved one, the person who tickles your fancy, and putting a lock on a pedestrian bridge with them to symbolize that your love is going to be there, I guess, as long as the lock is, right? Quite a romantic thing and quite a common thing to do. This is a way that pedestrian infrastructure on bridges really just like brings us together. It fosters connection. It allows us to be human at a human scale with one another in a way that a car bridge simply cannot do. Like, there's the physical limitations of somebody reaching out the door of their car and putting a lock on a bridge as they drive by. That's already pretty difficult. But then there's also the fact that it's just not a romantic thing to do. It's not a romantic space to be.
It won't be seen by somebody who is sort of then has an opportunity to linger and admire your love or the inscription you put on that lock, or, to even really notice you doing it. You're just a blur by their windshield.
And I think that pedestrian bridges, in some ways, put a fine point on the difference between human-scale pedestrian infrastructure and infrastructure that's constructed for cars. And so sometimes I'm critical of pedestrian bridges as almost being a Band-Aid on a gaping wound, where it's the reason we have to have this pedestrian bridge is because you made the environment so hostile to begin with all this car infrastructure. But on the positive side, of course, you can have these like really beautiful spaces that are just for people and really uplift our connection with other people. And I think it's a really cool thing that they foster.
I think, too, another thing you're getting at is the fact that we build primarily for the car. It's unthinkable to have a bridge that cars use all the time out. It's like the biggest nightmare of any like traffic engineer or someone who works for the city. I mean, just imagine, for instance, like how cars like cross over the South Platte River and into the sort of I-25 on Spear Boulevard. Imagine that was just like out.
Yeah.
Plans are made decades in advance for like where the funding is going to come from and how they're going to do certain things in order to like upgrade the bridge or extend the life of the bridge or totally replace the bridge. And at every step along the way, they don't just then shut down the bridge and say like, sorry, the bridge is out for 2 weeks. They like are shunting traffic to one side or another and like doing new traffic patterns, and everybody complains about it. But like you still have access to that.
Actually, this is quite poignant. In my neighborhood right now, there is a pedestrian bridge that crossed over a stream, and it's right next to an apartment complex that is for fixed-income seniors and people with disabilities. And this bridge connected them to like a free food market that enhanced food access in my neighborhood. That pedestrian bridge is out, and what we've heard from council is that they're very sorry, but there's just no money in the bridge fund to repair that bridge. And there's no timeline for when there might be money, which, to your point, it would be unthinkable for this to happen to the bridge over I-25 at Spear. The car infrastructure in this way is uplifted in a way that pedestrian infrastructure simply isn't. Because, yeah, again, just if the Spear Bridge over I-25 went out and they said, we have no plans to reopen this, we just don't have any money, people would riot.
Yeah. No, it's hard to imagine a way to get fired and voted out quicker than just saying like, well, we're not going to replace that vehicle bridge. It's gross and we don't like it.
And on some level, right, like as it should be, just extend that more, please, to the pedestrian realm as well.
I think part of this too is, again, as you were talking about, there's a network, right, for pedestrians, which is almost by definition more focused, smaller, more local than there is for vehicle travel. So vehicle travel is regional. It's great in a lot of ways that people can get very quickly from from up in the mountains to drive the ambulance down, the highway into the city in order to get somebody to the hospital. Fantastic. It's amazing that we have a technology that then enables somebody's life being saved, right? So a vehicle bridge tends to be part of kind of like more of a regional network versus what we're talking about here. The value of an actually good and thoughtful pedestrian bridge is in making more local trips happen, more cross-neighborhood, not cross-city transportation happen.
And one example our dear listeners will be very familiar with is the Delgany Bridge, which is at Delgany and the Cherry Creek Trail. Well-used pedestrian bridge, so well-used that I think at one point one of the planks fell through or something, and the city said this is too dangerous. Well, as it turns out, nobody knows who owns this thing. There was part of a land deal that a corporation, I believe, sold some land, and they owned this bridge, but they forgot to include it in the agreement. Corporation doesn't exist anymore, if my memory serves. Nobody owns this bridge. So, big announcement, dear listener. The Denver Urbanism Podcast is claiming Delgany Bridge as an independent nation. Denver Urbanism Landia.
We even have a flag made already, I believe.
Yes, we do. And we are just thrilled to, have our own country now. And everybody's invited. You might hurt yourself crossing it. But to your point, all jokes aside, that was a place that did foster a lot of the connection. And the reason people are so upset about the delay in getting that thing fixed is because it serves pedestrians in a way that a car bridge being out would simply be replaced by one 8 blocks down. 8 blocks on a pedestrian level is very difficult. In a car, again, it's just a little bit more inconvenient. Mm-hmm. So all of this, we've talked, I think, at length here about conceptually why we build bridges, what makes a good pedestrian bridge, what's a good context for a pedestrian bridge versus not, and maybe some of the differences between pedestrian and car infrastructure in the world of bridges specifically. I want to focus in now on Denver today. Where are we as a city? What's happening in the world of pedestrian bridges? Where's the momentum and where can people plug in?
This is why I get so annoyed about this stupid little idea of a bridge to nowhere. Otherwise, I have a bit of respect for the governor. I'm not trying to go in.
He's a listener.
I'm sure he is. No, I'm not trying to slander the man, but I'm just saying there are actual needs, right? We still have urban highways. The landscape has changed somewhat in recent years, right? We've made big investments to I-70. Maybe we didn't accomplish urbanist dreams with what they did to I-70, but there are new crossings of I-70 now, and there are more sort of surface at-grade ways to get over I-70 that involve a lot of bridges.
Including our first highway cap, I believe?
I can't think of another cover park that we have. And we have all of this new transit system, right? We have new train lines that go up and down and in and out of our city. Those train lines have to be accessible to people in the nearby neighborhoods, right? So we actually have a bunch of new bridges that were just built in the last 15 years in order to try and get people that live in a certain part of 5 Points over just across the tracks in order to get to the actual train station at 38th and Blake. there are more bridges like that coming out. Like right now, if you try and take the N line to the National Western Center, you are like in for such a cruel joke, because you have then like basically another mile walk around and like under this like weird little underpass in order to then get to the National Western Center, like from the National Western Center station.
Right.
There's going to be a bridge there pretty soon that's going to connect you immediately across the tracks. So a lot of change is happening, and it just frustrates me that the water is somewhat poisoned then by the notion of like, well, like pedestrian bridges are stupid. Look, people didn't want this one, that they were talking about in front of the, Colorado State House.
Right. That there is really good momentum happening in the city. Why do you think that is? I mean, obviously we don't have anyone from the bridge team here, but do you think that there's a sea change happening, sort of like we talked about with Wesley Dismore? Go listen to that episode right now. We'll wait until you're back. Welcome back. The episode with Wesley Dismore. What do you think is going on? Are we funding those more, or is it just we're a bigger city now and we're funding proportionally more bridges?
Well, I mean, I'm not a mathematician, James, so you're asking me a stats question there. But I think that there is a change in priority. People have been saying for years, yeah, I want to take the train. But right now, to take the train from my house means I got to walk over to this like jank crossing of Santa Fe Drive and the rail tracks, and then like walk on Evans Avenue, which is just gross. So, okay, great. We're going to make that person's life easier. We're going to build a bridge there. Also, again, I think you can't understate the fact that bridges cause new things to happen, right? The Lower Highlands is what we now kind of think of as a district because it is so much more easily connected to downtown right now. And Platt Street is so much more of a district because it got connected into the area that, emerged around Little Raven Street and Commons Park. That area can sort of only emerge because we were able to then build connections into other parts of town, in a network that is now more dense with pedestrian connections and cycling connections and transit connections. That actually just requires us then, if we want to keep getting more dividends for those services and to get more investment, to continue making more connections happen. Again, no one's taken the N line to the National Western Center. Not no one. I actually have a buddy who does do it. But then he has to like get on a scooter and go around like this like crazy mile kind of diversion. So if we want more people to do certain things, the bridges are completely logical in those types of circumstances. And it's advocacy. People have seen how much nicer it is to cross the W line on a pedestrian bridge as opposed to sort of going down to at-grade crossings that are like a little weird. There's something romantic about the bridge, as you mentioned earlier, that people just actually really enjoy and want, in their neighborhoods as well.
Yeah. So if somebody is listening to this and maybe there's a bridge that needs love, or maybe there is a bridge that they think would be a good idea in their neighborhood, is there anything they can do?
Well, we take out lots of bonds in this city. We're doing one again pretty quickly after we took out our last bond vote. So, dear listener, you could probably fill out a survey and say that you want another pedestrian bridge crossing a major barrier in your neighborhood, or that you think that the bridge that you have right now is old and needs to be replaced. It's on the capital improvement program to replace a number of vehicle bridges in the next 5 years or so. I assume some of those vehicle bridges are too expensive to replace with just normal city dollars and going to have to be funded with bond money. There should be a world of possibilities for spending bond money on pedestrian and cycling connections and projects. And again, if we want to get the most out of the investments that we've already made, we can't just stall out now and say, well, what are you guys talking about? There's 3 bridges over these tracks in 5 points. It's like, well, what if we had more often? There's also private ones that are planned. So, for instance, like no rendering of Ball Arena and River Mile is complete without a bunch of little new bridges over the CML there in that neighborhood. You need bridges in order to make that a neighborhood instead of just 2 separate neighborhoods that like wave at each other across the railroad tracks. Same for, out by Green Valley Ranch. There are some new bridges that are being planned that are going to make a ton of sense because of the new density that's going to go in that area. So there is already a pretty bright future. If you, aspiring engineer, are listening to this right now, bridges are just as classic and helpful as they've ever been in all of human history. But it does require like advocates actually looking out for new ways to improve the pedestrian realm. And that can be done with bridges in the right place. I assume that some possibly aesthetically pleasant thing could happen in front of the state capitol, and we would not all immediately be like, ew, ugly. Like, but there might be like some positive experience of that. But don't disguise it by saying like, it's really hard to cross Broadway and Lincoln. Yeah, they're busy streets. Yeah, they should be made better. Let's embrace the process of actually making the pedestrian realm better and not just throw a bridge on it, whenever we get confused.
Well, I think that's a great way to leave this. Hopefully, this has given you some context about how to decide when a pedestrian bridge might be the right solution. And if you do think it's the right solution, coordinate with some other folks. And there's forms online you can submit right now to put ideas out there for the city bond process. Bridges are expensive. They're very, very expensive. And bonds are one of the best ways we can raise the funds necessary to build them. So I think that's a great place to leave this.
The Denver Urbanism podcast is brought to you by longtime blog Denver Urbanism and sister blog Denver Infill. You can learn more online at denverurbanism.com. Thanks for listening. Never forget, can't spell bridge without I.
All right.
You've cut that shit. That's fine.
Podcast is over. I'm not doing this with you anymore.